May 29, 2003, we're in Pal Borofsky's office at Sam's department store in Brattleboro, Vermont. And I'd ask you to start by telling a little bit about, when we were out in the hallway, I was looking through those loose leaf notebooks and I saw something about your dad having been the one to first buy the store. Maybe you could tell a little bit about your parents and grandparents, what you know of your family background, and how you and they ended up in Brattleboro.
Well, what happened is the family came over from Russia. A few came over to begin with, and then they worked and they brought some others over. And I'm not sure who came over first. I know the grandfather came over first, and he brought a couple of the children over, and they all ultimately made enough money so that they brought the rest of the family over eventually. They started out living in New York City, and they eventually moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut. Let me take this off. They eventually moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and my grandfather had a coal and ice business. He used to sell coal and ice, and my father grew up in Bridgeport, and then ultimately went to New York City, and he opened up a delicatessen, and he had a delicatessen for a while, and then they peddled. They bought stuff at the market, vegetables, etc., maybe strawberries and other things, and they would go up to Connecticut and they would peddle them to houses and things of that nature. And this is it's a little, can you put it down here? I'll try and speak into it. It's a little annoying having it right in front of you.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Okay, but other than that, it's fine. It's just a little annoying having it right that close.
I'll raise the level a little bit.
Makes it easier
So
for you to photograph.
they kind of worked off sometimes they worked with my grandfather, but mostly they were all pretty independent. Ultimately, one of my father's brothers came to New England, and he started a store in Keene, New Hampshire, and he bought a store in Brattleboro, Vermont, and he coaxed my father into coming up here to run the store, and my father came up here, and he ultimately bought the store from my uncle, and then they went in business together, and they opened other stores. And a lot of the brothers ultimately wound up opening stores similar to this. They were really basically work stores. They were called Army-Navy stores. And they served, Army-Navy stores derived out of the idea that they served the immigrants. They bought, after World War I, they bought clothing, surplus clothing or used clothing from the government, and they went in front of the factories and peddled it on push carts and things of this nature. And they made enough money. They made that selling used merchandise. There was more money in that than selling new merchandise, because they used to sell pants for a quarter or whatever, and the immigrants couldn't afford to buy real new stuff. So they opened up stores. They had these push carts, and they eventually they became so wealthy selling this clothing that because of the inclement weather, the cold, and everything else, they opened up stores, and they called them Army-Navy stores. So Army-Navy stores grew after both war years, and that was a very viable option for people who were factory workers, because they bought inexpensive type clothing. So they serviced that trade. So my father came into Brattleboro and became a business person through that endeavor. The other, my growing up in Vermont was, I was born in Keene, New Hampshire, and my father used to travel back and forth to Brattleboro to open a store, because he lived in Keene as well. And we belonged to the Jewish. My mother was a kind of an initiator of the Jewish temple over there in Keene. She was kind of a charter person that was initiated that whole program. So they opened up they had a temple in Keene, and my father used to commute. And then ultimately he wound up moving here. He bought the store in 1932, and we moved here in 1937, and around 1937. And so we've lived in Brattleboro all that time. And throughout the early years being in Vermont, I was the only Jewish child, other than my brother, in the school system that professed to be Jewish. In other words, there may have been a lot of other people, but they were they didn't either claim to be Jewish or they didn't announce that they were Jewish. There were 8 Jewish families in Brattleboro. There was the next child to me was about 7 or 8 years away. My brother was ahead of me. He was older than I was, about 7.5 years. So he was in the system before me. Most all the other people that were Jewish in the community were actually in business. One owned a butcher market, another owned a family clothing store. It was kind of a men's shop, and there was a meat man. There was a person who was a meat. There were other people that were in. There was a pharmacy, and there was another guy that was involved in Margolin's, which was a factory. It used to be out of. His father-in-law was in Fitchburg. Actually, his father-in-law was in Fitchburg, but owned a factory in Brattleboro, and they used to sell to Sears and Roebuck pocketbooks. And then there was an overall factory. These people were Jewish, but those were the only Jewish people that I knew of. Actually, later on, I found out that there was another merchant on the street who had a ladies' dress shop who was Jewish. But that would have been in the period of from 41 to 46 or 47 or 48 or 49, somewhere in that period. So that was that group. There was never any attempt to start a synagogue or anything like that. My brother and I were bar mitzvahed. He was bar mitzvahed in Keene, and I was bar mitzvahed in Greenfield. I used to travel back and forth to Greenfield to get my Jewish education. And after all, my mother was we moved to Greenfield for the temples, but we lived in Brattleboro. Ultimately, my 2 children were bar mitzvahed in Greenfield, so now all of a sudden, Brattleboro has a fairly large community of Jewish people who are in the process right now of trying to build a synagogue. They bought a piece of property, and apparently they're going to renovate an old house, and that's where we are.
So the organization that Faith Schuster is with actually predates a synagogue. I mean, in other words, isn't that like a Jewish community center or something like that?
Faith is probably a very strong member of the community, and she is a recent president, the initiator of the temple, the initiator of the Jewish community, was really started by a guy by the name of Bill Grossman. He's a doctor who now is started out in Brattleboro and has come back, and he had the initiative along with another person, with Ben Gotkoff and Scylla Karetnik, who was an Israeli who came back here. Her husband was running a restaurant an Italian restaurant. She was an Israeli, and she helped with services and a lot of that. But it was really Ben Gotkoff and Bill Grossman, Dr. Grossman, and Cecilia, who were initiators of the movement. And there were other people who assisted them, but those people were the driving force kind of behind it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the other, whatever it was, there were 8 other families, but your family was evidently was the only family that had kids in the school system. At that time, we were the only children in the school system. The other ones was a meat cutter, Zelbo. They had children after us. Uh-huh. And you said that there might very well have been other Jewish people that just didn't identify themselves. Was there the kind of pressure on you socially on those people to not be open about it?
I'm sure I didn't understand the pressure. Only sometimes when I went to school, a lot of people weren't aware of the word Jew or Jewish or whatever, and from that point of view, there really wasn't cognizant in the community. Certainly there were signs in the community that people didn't want Jews. There was a sign on a big sign on a road out of town that said restricted on it. And of course that meant Jews and blacks at that particular point.
For like a hotel or something like that?
No, actually it was kind of I'm not sure if it was a hotel, maybe more of a club. But there were a lot of the social fraternal organizations did not take Jews. And a country club and things of that nature. So there were a lot of organizations in the community that were very definitely anti-Jewish.
Now,
And I'm sure anti-black too.
Yeah. Did you live in downtown Brattleboro with your family,
No,
or
we lived in
outside?
We lived in town, about a mile from town.
Yeah. Was it? I guess what I'm trying to find out was, were you surrounded by countryside or?
No.
Or yeah.
We were in residential homes housing.
Yeah. Yeah. To your knowledge, were there any Jews who lived out of town? On big pieces of land, farming or anything like that?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
I couldn't speak to that.
Yeah.
But there were. My parents were friendly with Italians, very very friendly with a group of Italian people, and we were friendly with other people. But basically, as a kid, we didn't acknowledge the pressure or feel the pressure, except when we got into sometimes later on in school systems we had a problem. But not, it wasn't prevalent amongst the people I associated with on a daily basis.
I'm wondering about when you reached, teenage sort of dating years. How important was it then? I mean, were your parents the kind of people that would want you and your brother to date Jewish girls, or was?
Well, I don't know. My parents were pretty open. My mother did keep keep kosher for quite a few years, till after we were bar mitzvahed, and at that point, she had to go through a hassle to get the food. She used to have to go to Worcester and Springfield, Mass, to get the Jewish food, but she kept kosher and she kept the high holidays. My father certainly observed the religion. He wasn't a religious person. He wasn't educated as far as the religion was concerned. In other words, he was not an authority. He didn't really understand an awful lot. I don't believe he read Jewish. He read Hebrew very well. But certainly there were instances where there were problems. But my mother never pressured me to marry a Jewish person. Matter of fact, when I started going out with my wife now, who wasn't Jewish, I said to my mother, I'm going to stop going out with this girl because she's not Jewish. And my mother said, don't let that bother you. So at that particular point, my mother was not concerned about it, and my father never passed any judgment in that way.
I think you mentioned that your kids were bar mitzvahed.
Yes.
Right. So somewhere along the line, it's
My wife converted.
I see. Yeah. And do your kids still live in the community?
Oh yeah, my son's with me. That was my son's doing.
Oh, okay. So they're part of that Jewish community. That
Well, they
exists in
don't.
the area?
They don't take a big part of it.
Uh-huh.
They certainly are Jewish
Yeah.
because they were bar mitzvahed and they had a Jewish education.
Yeah.
My sons can read far better than I can.
Uh-huh.
I can't read Jewish at all.
Uh-huh. Yeah. When roughly when did because you mentioned being just part of this tiny little minority of business owners and so on. When did Brattleboro begin to, as you say now, there's quite a large number of Jewish families. When did that start to happen? Roughly.
Well, I think in the evolution of time, I think what's happened is the community, through the atmosphere of interfaith relations, has grown dramatically in the past 15 to 20 years. And I can't put a time on when they were really started, when Grossman and the other guys really did a big job in trying to push the atmosphere of the synagogue and the services. But I would guess probably about 18 to 20 years ago, the push started. But in the past 8 or 10 years, there's been a much stronger influence of people participating in services locally and wanting to build a Jewish society in Brattleboro. I think over the past 10 to 15 years, a lot more people have moved into the area. I think the influence of the Stratton, Wilmington area has brought an awful lot of second homeowners who have come out of the city, who are Jewish, who have funds, who have bought houses and participate in the atmosphere of the skier and things of that nature. And they come here probably because it's less expensive to go to services on the high holidays. They participate because of they take the vacations. They're here. They can spend the time up here, so they go to temple here. So for all intents and purposes, I think that's where a lot of the people are coming from. I think the evolution of time, if you go back and see what's happened, is that a lot of people shunned the Jewish religion in the local community. Were upset with a lot of people didn't accept it. But as these people became more active in trying to have services, we rented a facility from the Catholic school to have our services in. So there was a give and take from both atmospheres. They allowed us to come in, and the Jewish people that were here were not too proud to go into a Catholic facility and participate in that realm. So for all intents and purposes, there's been a lot of society. Right now, the synagogue is in a Unitarian church. In other words, they share services with them. So there's been a real giving in the community to the Jewish people and the atmosphere of a synagogue. I think it's making great strides in the community from that point of view.
Besides the, you mentioned second homeowners, I assume that there's also a sizable number of year-round people as well. Do those people tend to be also business people, professionals, or is there not really a pattern?
At this stage of the game, I really can't give you a good answer. There seem to be a lot of people in both aspects. In other words, there seem to be some people who are financially sound, very well off, and there seem to be others that are far more dependent and on a daily basis for jobs. But I think there's both.
What was I going to say? Oh, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. You mentioned your dad's family background. Was your mother's background similar to that?
Yes.
Were her family
Her
Russian?
family came in from Russia too.
Did you ever hear from either of your parents about Russia, about the old country?
They used to have stories. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember?
My father came over very small, so he would have the only relationships that he would have for understanding would have been any of the stories that he heard. He did remember the farm they lived on.
Oh.
But he was so small. It was pretty tough.
Yeah. What do you remember from him telling you about that place?
Well, they just told me that they used to sleep in the barns, and that they were. They don't remember. They didn't remember an awful lot. Most of the kids were pretty young
when they made the trip over. You mean, yeah.
The two older brothers. We never really got in a lot of conversation about their previous history. I'm sure my father did with his brothers to a degree.
And you mentioned your mother keeping kosher, at least when she was able to. Do you remember some of the foods that she made?
I remember all the foods.
Oh, well, can you tell me about some of them?
Oh, she made the potato latkes and the matzah brei, and she made all meats, and she made hamantaschen, and she made all that stuff. Kahalas, and
Yeah.
she baked everything.
Uh-huh. What did you have an active? When it was Friday evening, did you always have a
She used to
Shabbat?
light the candles.
Yeah.
She lit the candles every Friday.
And,
We didn't have a ceremony
Uh-huh.
as far as eating, but she used to light the candles on her own.
Mm-hmm. You didn't have sisters.
No.
Yeah. And then you said that at that time you and your family would travel to Keene to go to services.
We used to go to services to go to Keene.
Yeah. Huh.
But that would be in the period from about 1940 through to 1940 to probably around 45 or 6.
Was there a larger Jewish community there than in Brattleboro?
Oh yeah,
Huh.
a lot bigger.
Yeah.
Very small. There were only really 8 families that we knew of
Yeah.
in Brattleboro. But in order, Keene had a wide variety of people.
Huh. Business owners and that sort of thing, or?
Yeah, a lot of them were in business.
Huh. Yeah.
But there were a lot of people that weren't in business too.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm just sort of wondering why such a large group there and smaller here.
Well, I think probably I wasn't as familiar with the group in Keene as I was in Brattleboro.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there were business owners in Keene as well, but I don't associate them as easily because I was older when I came to Brattleboro, and I only went to Keene on holidays, and so I really didn't know an awful lot of the people as a congregation. I knew certain people in Keene that my mother and father socialized with, but those were probably maybe 5 or 6 families.
Mhm.
Those families, most of them were in business. A lot of them had struggling businesses,
Mm-hmm.
as I remember.
Yeah. So I can say, you don't happen to know when exactly when the family was in Bridgeport?
Not really.
Roughly. I'm asking for personal reasons because that's where my father grew up, and his dad came there, also from Russia.
I would guess probably 14. I would probably say 1914, 13 to about 1920,
Yeah.
20 somewhere there.
Yeah, my dad was born in 1914 in Bridgeport,
Yeah.
and I guess his family was there into the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, probably my grandparents were there in the. I remember visiting my grandparents in the 40s in Bridgeport.
Uh-huh.
So they would have been there probably from the late teens, early 20s to the 40s.
Yeah. Huh. All right. Well, I think unless there's other.
Giving you all I can tell.
Yeah, that's great. No, I appreciate it very much. Very generous.